Hi, and welcome to another Community Learning Lab brought to you by the Nathan and Esther Peltz Holocaust Education Resource Center, or HERC for short. My name is Sam Goldberg. I'm HERC's Education Director. And as April is Genocide Awareness Month, we have invited author, advocate, and storyteller Carl Wilkens. He is known as the only American civilian to stay throughout the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. This genocide officially began on April 7th, 1994, and took place over 100 days, resulting in the murder of at least 800,000 Tutsi. So Carl, thank you so much for being here. And for those of you that don't, for those of us that don't know you, could you start off by telling us a little bit about your story and why you were in Rwanda to begin with?
Sure. Thanks for the invitation. I love HERC, by the way. That just sticks. Yeah, when I was a little kid, I used to read stories about Africa and was mesmerized by them. And in college, I got sick of classes, and we had a great service learning program. So I volunteered for a year back in 1978 in South Africa, and that hooked me. I just, you love it when you're someplace where you feel like you connect and you make a difference. You're part of something that can make a difference. And so went back to college, re-energized, trained as a shop teacher, got married. 6 weeks later, my wife and I moved to Zimbabwe. I was a school teacher, and then we were working at a remote hospital in Zambia. Then came back to school again, got an MBA, and that's when we moved to Rwanda. This peaceful, gorgeous little country. If anybody knew anything about it, it would be the mountain gorillas. This land of 1,000 hills. And boy, 6 months after we got there, a war started. We had that 3-year war, but then we still found a way to navigate and work. We were building schools and operating clinics, things like that, just partnering with the Rwandan people. So when the genocide hit, as you mentioned, in April 1994, we had already been there for 4 years, built a lot of relationships, friendships, and so then this thing exploded on us, and of course, was like nothing we'd seen before.
Yeah, and so what was the reason that you stayed there? I mean, I read your book. You had explicit instructions to leave Rwanda, to leave Kigali, and you pretty famously said, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving." So what made you decide that?
Yeah. When you say explicit instructions, I'm like, that's true. That's true. They were really clear. There was no hesitation. We had, like I said, been there for 4 years. Our kids, let's see, I think I got a picture of our kids when we moved there. It was home for them. They just really enjoyed playing in the neighborhood, and yeah, my work was there. And so it was just very much home. And there was this young lady who lived and worked. We can get into history maybe a little bit later, but there was a young lady who lived and worked in our home. And she just loved on our kids. And when somebody loves on your kids, that's like fast track to family. The killing had started right away, but the plane is shot down Wednesday night. By Friday, the embassy is ordering everybody out, and most European governments were evacuating their people by air, but I don't know, maybe because the president's plane was shot down, but the American, Canadian, and I feel like German, I feel like those three were together saying, no, we're going to drive to Burundi, to the south. I don't think it's safe to try to fly out here. And so load your family up. In fact, here's a picture of our family just days, probably a week before the genocide. And as you might notice, my mom and dad are here visiting us at that time. And so obviously our first priority is family, get your family to safety. But in many ways, our family had grown. And so when the embassy said, you can't bring any Rwandans, then it's like, well, wait a minute, because, this young lady, her ID card marked her as part of the minority that was targeted as the enemy. This young man who came in the evening, watchman, he too had a Tutsi ID card. And so my wife and I, we go in the bedroom, we're talking, we're praying, and we're like, these people have been so kind to us. They've been so generous. And we came to see if we could help. And if ever they needed help, now is the time. And we thought, you know what, maybe because they treat us so kind of, because they give us privilege, maybe we could use that privilege to help these two people. Now, we didn't know more than 1 million people would be killed. I'm not even sure that we knew of the, where did I think I had a picture here of the UN soldiers. I'm not even sure that I knew that the UN soldiers were going to leave, more than 2,500 of these UN soldiers. I mean, we knew the president had been killed. The next day, Thursday, they killed the prime minister. They killed all of these Belgian UN soldiers. We knew a lot of the violence that had happened. These were the soldiers who were supposed to be the bodyguards for the prime minister. But, the planners were really strategic. We've got to get rid of the UN. We got to get rid of the foreigners. And so my wife and I are like, okay, our kids, no question, we got to get them out of here to safety. But how can we abandon these two people who are in our home? And when you put on a family lens, you start looking at something through like the lens of a family, things look different. And just that idea that as a foreigner, they gave us such privilege, maybe I could get people to actually pause. If they were coming to kill the people, maybe they could pause for a moment and we could kind of try to access the humanity that the fight flight part of your brain, the terror part of your brain just kind of shuts down that good place, the frontal lobe. Yeah. Maybe we could get people just to pause a moment. And fortunately it worked. These two people did survive the genocide, and my wife, here they are. My wife and my mom and dad and our children went to safety. My dad wanted to stay with me, but I'm like, no, Dad, I need you to take the family to safety. I was just talking to a friend the other day, and she had been in a seminar, and they were talking about regulating your emotions and how in traumatic or difficult times or something we might have trouble regulating. And they talk about somebody next to you co-regulating. And right away, my mind went to, I remember asking our middle daughter, Lisa, were you afraid? She goes, no. Well, why not? Because Mom wasn't afraid. Mom, Teresa, was right there co-regulating with the kids. And so, I never would have thought I'd use the word like co-regulating, but as you try to unpack what happened there, really brain science and social emotional intelligence, those are the things that help us really learn what we need to learn, maybe even to prevent something like this, because this was preventable. Those 2,500 UN soldiers who left, if they would have stayed and been supported, General Dallaire, their Canadian commander, convinced they could have stopped the genocide.
Yeah, and you touched on a few things that I wanted to bring up. I know I'm going off of your questions that I gave you ahead of time.
No problem.
One is that for people that don't know the history that well, you mentioned it briefly, that it was the ID cards, really, the fact that your family had these Tutsi ID cards, and that really that was the death sentence, and that the majority Hutu were really the ones that were targeting these minority. So I just wanted to make sure that we gave that historical context. But then the other thing I wanted to mention is that you said yourself that you might not have known at this time that you were making this decision to stay and send your family, that you might not have known that the prime minister had been killed, 10 Belgians had been killed, and that the UN would be receding and leaving, like they would be being pulled out of Rwanda. Did that, at any point once you learned all of that, or at any point during the genocide, did you think maybe this wasn't the best decision to stay? Did you ever have that moment?
The 65-year-old Carl asked the 36-year-old Carl, what were you thinking? I have those moments after, like, really? But during that time, no. I mean, there were times of discouragement, but as long as the two people in our house were alive, and then we started working with Rwandan colleagues to bring food and water and medicine to groups of orphans, as long as you felt like you're making a difference, that really that really holds back the hopelessness that a genocide would generate. And that little bit of history, I'm glad you mentioned that too. The ID cards were so crucial. Here, the word Hutu is crossed out, Tutsi is not. But I think it's really important that this was not something that spontaneously happened from one group of people hating another group. This is really constructed by a relatively small group of men and women who, when the plane is shot down, it's still debated who shot the plane down, but when that is shot down, this relatively small group, the architects of the genocide, launch a coup. And I think it's really important people recognize, this is not just genocide, this is a coup. And the first priority of the coup government is exterminating whoever they see as the enemy. And when I started traveling maybe 19 years ago to schools, I was like, how am I going to explain genocide? How do we start to wrap our head around it? And I came up with this little expression here. Genocide stems from thinking that says my world would be better without you in it. And that kind of problem solving, that exclusive problem solving, I think is one of the reasons it's so important for us to be studying this, to understand that this will always just give you a temporary solution at best, elimination, problem solving, and it'll give you genocide at worst. Also, that it doesn't, it's not always something that's like inevitable. This was really a relatively small group of men and women who seems like they could have encountered. In fact, I was asking some middle school kids back in December in Colorado, who else do you think could have stood in the way of these people who were leading the genocide? And this one boy raised his hand, I hadn't thought about it this way before, but he raised his hand and he says, maybe somebody close to them. And I thought, whoa, I was thinking maybe you might say school teachers or, some sort of professionals or other government officials or, somebody with armed power or something. And I thought to myself, in the classroom, who's really influencing my thinking, my feelings, and my choices. And so there's so much to try to unpack as you dig back, and we won't go all the way back in the history, but thanks for giving me that little chance.
No, of course. And you briefly mentioned it, like about as long as you were staying productive during that time, that was reason enough to stay. Could you share a little bit about what you were doing during those 100 days? Because honestly, I think if I had stayed, and as soon as I realized that it was becoming what it was, I feel like it would have been very easy to just say, I'm going to stay here until someone comes to find me, and to hunker down. But you didn't do that. So if you can share a little bit about what you did during that time.
Absolutely. I love this little collection of pictures right here, because these are the key people that I worked with during the genocide. And, in our house already was the young lady and the young man. And then I invited Pastor and Mrs. Soraya to come and join me in my home. Now, they weren't there hiding. Their ID card didn't mark them for extermination, but she was like the one who helped us to get food. And even when people came to the gate wanting to kill the people in our house, she would go talk to them like a mother, like an auntie, to de-escalate things. And the pastor, sorry, that picture's a little bit washed out there, but the pastor, he's just this like deep well of wisdom and advice and counsel. And I remember after 3 weeks of being in our house, not going out for 3 weeks, the government finally, the coup government, lifted the curfew, 24/7 curfew they had placed on everybody. They said, if you got a good reason, you can come out and get a travel permit. Well, Pastor and I were sitting there talking after breakfast one morning. I said, it's really good that we're all still alive and things, but there must be more. What else do you think we could do? And he makes this really, he gives me this really profound piece of advice. He says, if you're going to do anything outside of our house here, you got to build a relationship with the people in power. These are the people who are doing genocide. And so that's where it's going to begin. I don't know what I'm going to do to help afterwards, but I'll go and meet up with the head of the coup government for the capital city, the leaders of the coup government, because the fighting was so intense. You see, there had been 3 years of war with the Rwandan Patriotic Front. These were basically refugees of Rwanda who had fled Rwanda at the time of independence 30 years earlier. You know, independence was 1961 too. Anyway, and so these people had wanted to come back, were not allowed back. 10, 20, 30 years. Finally, they got military training and weapons, and they came back by force. And they're led actually by General Paul Kagame, and they're called the Rwandan Patriotic Front. So that was the 3-year war before the genocide. Then there was a peace agreement. Everybody laid their guns down and were like, yeah, we're going to have peace. But that small group of extremists, no, 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 we will never share power. So when the plane is shot down, these men and women of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by General Kagame, will pick up their guns and they'll start fighting this what we call coup government, or this genocidal government. And they actually are the ones who will end the genocide. So because the fighting was so because the fighting was so intense, the extremists will leave the capital city and they'll leave Colonel Renzaho in charge. And Colonel Renzaho and I will form a relationship, and something even at times that might have resembled a friendship, which you can see the face I'm making.
You're like gritting your teeth.
Yeah, he's going to be captured and tried and convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity. And that's another big thing about trying to understand this story, because typically, you know, even if you come in like on a movie late or something, then you're like, okay, wait a minute, is this a good guy or bad guy? We just constantly think good guy, bad guy, which is really a myth. It's not. History proves there's people who do the same person, people who do some really generous, kind things, and they do some really hostile, violent things. So cutting it quicker here, a little bit short, I will meet the colonel. He will give me a travel permit, and he'll say, look, there's some orphanages that could use some assistance. You see, he and the extremist government are going to be, they're going to be trying to put forth to the world that we're at war here. You know, not that we got this dirty little secret we're doing genocide, but they're trying to put out like, you know, we're just at war in this country. And of course, the genocide is the main goal of what they're doing right then. So anyway, he will send me to a couple of orphanages. And that's why, come back to my picture here, down here in the bottom corner is Damas and his wife, Beatrice. Damas, probably 34 at the time of the genocide. They've got a little 9-month-old baby, and he has a majority ID card. She has a minority ID card, and but his orphanage will grow from like 80 kids to 180 to over 400 kids. The other two gentlemen here in the picture, my friend up top here with his son Dawson, was working with me with ADRA, and he was helping me during this time to bring food and water, as well as my friend Gasikwa, who was also helping me bring food and water. And if I could just hijack for a moment, if I haven't already, but I want you to look at this story of my friend Gasikwa. He had more than 40 people. These are little screenshots from a 40-minute film that we send to schools before I come and speak. It's on YouTube. You just look, I'm Not Leaving full movie. You'll find that 40-minute film. But he's got more than 40 people in his house that he's trying to protect. And when they come to kill the people in his home, he comes out with chicken. Well, I don't know if he actually had the chickens in his hands, but we're drawn to tell the story in the movie.
Yeah.
But he says to his neighbors, these are really hard. I mean, okay, I see them, I think killers. Enemy, he sees them, fathers, neighbors. Your family must be hungry. Your kids hungry? These are hard times. Do you want some chickens to take home? And I love this story for so many different reasons. But we're often in our 20 minutes today, we're not going to be able to go as deep as we might, in a longer time. But we're often wondering why. How could people do this? How could neighbors turn on neighbors? And I found so much help in the framework of how the brain works. We're super familiar, the amygdala kind of right there in the center, that fight flight part, and how these people have been at war for 3 years. They've been going, okay, Dan Siegel calls it the downstairs, the upstairs and downstairs brain. And they've been running to the downstairs during this 3 years of war regularly, consistently. So the most effective way you can control people, is this the most effective? It's definitely the most practiced, is fear. The reason I'm saying is because I want love to be the most effective way. But anyway, what we see in history, the most evident way is fear. And when we can get people in the fight flight, it's almost like they lose the ability to connect the dots empathetically, even logically. And so Gasikwa comes out with chickens, and with kindness, he just, he diffuses that situation. And so I've often thought, he was working with me during the day, but what about his wife and kids and all the people in his house while he was gone? The people that I was surrounded with were people of incredible courage and strength and resilience. And he really demonstrates what I love, this idea of empathy first. He responds to a crisis with empathy. Unfortunately, I'm more likely to respond with judgment instead of curiosity. These are my empathy glasses. Or, to like, get these guys out of here, respond with exclusion instead of connection. But Gasikwa really, that's the story that just I wanted to put in here because it's such a meaningful story to me.
Yeah, it's so incredible. Like that, I think when you're met with, the quote unquote bad guys that are approaching you with aggressiveness, and to react with kindness, it takes a lot of self-control.
What was it he and his downstairs brain, You're like, he's under attack, but he's got years of integrity, years of compassion, years of empathy. He's got, the other part of the conversation would be neuroplasticity and how we build new pathways in our brain, but he's got years of building pathways in his brain of compassion and empathy that I think kept him from being hijacked by the amygdala, by the downstairs brain. And it's remarkable. Gives me a lot of hope.
That kind of is leading us into our next question, is that obviously this story, this history has impacted your life tremendously, and the people that you met and everything. Obviously, that even like after the genocide, being reunited with your family, you are thinking about all of these things. You saw the people you met. So, and now obviously you speak to students, you speak to schools, you speak to the community about this whole idea of empathy and what to do in the face of fear like that. So
and how to put the pieces back together.
Yeah, exactly. So that's like, when did you decide that like, this isn't just something I went through, but this is something I'm going to take and run with. I'm going to be an advocate. I'm going to tell this story. And I can tell just from speaking to you, if no one else has heard you speak before, that it's very clear you are not like, this is the Carl Wilkens show. You're highlighting all these people that we would not otherwise have known. I did not know the stories that you told. I knew your story, but I didn't know their story. And I'm so thrilled that I'm being able to hear all the different acts of kindness that were there. So when did you decide that this is something that you're going to do, that you're going to be this storyteller for genocide education and really promoting this empathy and peace and advocacy work that you've been doing?
Let me give you the long short story. Make short of this long story. 2003, the U.S. Holocaust Museum is hosting an event where they brought a survivor from the Holocaust to help children in France, a woman, and they brought Damas Gasimba, who was helping children in Rwanda during the genocide, for an event there at the museum. And then Damas told them about me, and they're like, well, okay, the program's already planned, but can you come anyway, Carl? We'll send you a plane ticket. And I was on the West Coast, that's on the East Coast. So I'm like, yeah. Well, long story short, one of the directors, the assistant director of a documentary that many people who've dug into Rwanda are familiar with, Ghost of Rwanda, Julie Powell, was at that event. And Julie, she said, we're making this film about the genocide. You were there. Can we interview you? And I'm like, sure. And I didn't actually know anything much about Frontline. I'd spent most of my adult life in Rwanda, in Africa. But anyway, so when that document.
Oh, I think we lost you for a second.
Teachers say,
oh. if you can hear us, we lost you for a second.
So that interview with the documentary Ghost of Rwanda that eventually was aired on Frontline on PBS is what teachers, that documentary is what teachers started using, trying to get a handle. How do I teach? You know, then it was just 10 years old. You know, now it's almost 30 years old. Well, when that documentary came out and teachers saw this American had been there, they started just randomly asking me. So it's not like I decided, it's like teachers decided, would you come? I mean, of course, I had to accept their invitation. And after 4 years of doing that, a couple of days a month, excuse me, I started doing it, my wife and I, full time in 2008. We formed a little nonprofit called World Outside My Shoes. And we started just traveling to schools, first in America and then around the world. And initially, you know, we're telling the story of the genocide. Excuse me. Initially, we're telling the story of the genocide. But then, of course, in 2009, I start taking teachers to Rwanda and start collecting more stories in Rwanda of how are they putting things together now. And so then things will shift until today. I love when I can spend most of my time talking about the restorative practices in Rwanda, how they're putting the pieces back together, how the government empowered the local people to bring healing to their community and to bring justice to their country. It's a phenomenal story. And so in many ways, I think it's like, you know, this story just kind of took on a life of its own, and one thing led to another to another. And I thought, you know, maybe I'd do it for a couple of years, but I'm still doing it 19 years later. And I think one of the things too that keeps me on it is the teachers I work with, just incredible teachers. And then the students, you know, people will say to me, the kids, are they really interested in stuff? I'm like, well, the ones I talk to are, but of course I talk to classes where a lot of times kids have chosen that elective, you know, and so, yeah, they're interested. But I think one of the reasons they're so interested is because we see the relevance. We can see similarities. My world would be better without you in it. We've had those messages way too common in America over the years, and especially in recent years, you know, and as we study about how the brain works and stuff, we start to think, oh no, this is not just some, you know, uncivilized or brutal group of people in Africa. We look back at our own history and we realize where we've done genocide in America. And so that relevance, I think, has been super important to kind of like at the beginning, I said, you know, if you can be involved in something, you feel like you're making a difference, and you know, if you've got a purpose and there's a relevance, and that's what we found. And yeah, I don't know how long, I'm still feeling pretty good. And we get to do virtual stuff like this with you, or last week I was in New York and North Carolina, and we get to visit classrooms. So we're grateful for these opportunities.
Yeah, and I mean, we're going to kind of, the last two questions I have for you are really going to touch on that relevance and about what people can do. But first, I'm just, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, April is Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month. So just what does that mean to you, that we have this recognition in April?
Yeah, I really appreciate your questions. I got a whole bunch of pictures, and I'm like, okay, because I'm a visual learner, so I've always got to pull a picture up. But this is one that usually stops us in our tracks, you know, and we just silently look at this and we think, how could we do this? This is actually, sorry, the sunlight went away, and so my room has gotten dark and my screen has gotten bright. But there's a flame that burns at the Kigali Genocide Memorial during the 100 Days of Remembering in Rwanda that they do every year. And I think it's so crucial. What Rwanda has done is they've really made this a time of remembering, a time of renewing, and a time of reconnecting and unity. And so that idea that we want to remember, but we're not just remembering to open old wounds or to make us angry. something like that. No, we're remembering so that we can learn, we can honor the people for sure. And I think the best way we honor, this is kind of crazy that for a long time, until one time I confronted one guy who is the leader of a killing squad during the genocide, and I ran into him in a prison in Rwanda. And it was only after I was journaling about that that I realized, you know what? You think subconsciously that staying angry at a perpetrator is honoring the victims. And I hope as you hear me say that, you can see how that doesn't make sense. But when you don't examine our subconscious beliefs, they still have impact on our thinking and our feelings and our actions. So that's why I'm a big advocate of journaling and stuff. But a memorial gives us a chance to examine too our subconscious beliefs and recognize staying angry at the perpetrator doesn't honor the people that were killed. It's breaking the cycle of violence that can honor the people who were killed. And that has become such an important part for me of not only telling the story of 1994, but then the story of how people are putting things together. I mean, we maybe could have another conversation to talk about that at some point, but I'll just show you for a moment here. You look at this. This is a community court in Rwanda. There were more than 12,000 of these community courts where if you wanted to confess, like this man in the pink prison uniform, you could come and confess in front of the community. There's this whole form of justice based on an old, a long time practice in Rwanda called gacaca. And so I think, this is, there's so much for us to learn from Rwanda. Yes, from the dark, horrible days of the genocide, but also from how they put the pieces back together. And so that then, and this is what they're working on. They're working on breaking the cycle of violence. They're working on understanding the harm that happened and then trying to put forth a repair plan, begin to talk, learn the truth. So these are all parts of this journey of why it's so important to dig into these stories and then to have times not just of history lessons, but of really stopping to honor and remember the people who were killed and think, how can we break that cycle of violence?
And the final question I have for you today is, what can everyday people do? If we learned anything from your story and the stories of the others that you've met along the way, is that everyday people have the power to do something great. So what can people do in their everyday lives? We're not all going to ignore the explicit instructions to leave violence, but like in everyday life, breaking that cycle of violence, what can the everyday individual do?
I really appreciate that question. And sometimes I struggle with that question a lot. And this is where I am currently with a graphic that can sort of begin to talk about that question. I think, what really is at stake here is our ability to connect, right now with the people in Ethiopia who've been suffering so much in the Tigray region, or with, people in Syria, other places around the Ukraine, all of these things. And I think the key to really lasting, strong connections is right now, in my mind, kind of a three-phase process. Preparing ourselves. Sometimes we want to just get right out there and do it, and what can we do to stop this? And there are times we need to step forward and, get involved in activism, advocacy, talking to your representative and stuff. But on the long term, we really need to prepare ourselves. Like John Lewis, he would say in the civil rights movement, we would work in the basement of churches about nonviolence. This is our way forward with the civil rights movement. If you're not ready to be kicked and spat on and not fight back during this upcoming demonstration we're planning, he said, stay in the basement and keep preparing yourself. So there's a lot to involved with social emotional intelligence and so many things to prepare ourselves. That's this education part. And then once we've gotten tools, social emotional tools and other things like that, we can begin to reframe the world that we see. We see the world differently. We can begin. Part of preparation is understanding nonviolence, for example. And then you begin to see the world not as enemies, like I would have called Gasikwa's neighbors, but actually like Gasikwa saw them, as neighbors, as friends. And there's so many, reframing is one of my favorite tools, that in every situation, fact, just watched a great TED talk, What's Right with the World, a photographer from National Geographic. And he says, there's more than one right answer to every situation. There's more than one good picture in every setting. And so this idea of reframing the problems, reframing our role, reframing the enemy. The enemy might be a really important ally, actually, in this thing. You know, the pastor telling me, if you're going to do anything, got to build a relationship with the people in power. So reframing is just one of several really important tools we begin to develop. Then we go and begin to engage. And engaging is, for me, learning the stories of the people who are in harm's way, the people who are being prejudiced and being dehumanized. And as we begin to learn their story, we look for partners who are helping locally, that really know the story. And we listen to the local people and how, because they can solve the problem and we can be a partner to that solution. So this is kind of right now my three kind of step or approach to what can we do, and whether it's in our neighborhood or whether it's across the globe. But I definitely, you know, another framework might be education and advocacy. And, you know, how do we engage in those different ones? But boy, when we start learning people's stories, sometimes we start learning the stories and that drives us to want to prepare and then engage. So I'm still not sure of the form here, but those are some thoughts that I hope will help.
Thank you so much. I believe the 29th anniversary this year.
That's right.
So I hope that you will take Carl's advice and really learn the stories of both that history and other histories of genocide, as this is Genocide Awareness Month, and also just opening up to seeing what's out there and who you can engage with today in your life. But thank you, Carl Wilkens, so much for speaking with us today. And we'll be sure to link some.
Thank you. And thanks for the work of HERC. Really looking forward to partnering in some future projects as well.
Absolutely. Us too.
All right. Take care.